And hello there, this is Don Kettle from the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin. And today we want to explore the issues of Black Lives Matter, especially as it affects the people of India who have been working in a very different kind of way on very similar kinds of issues. And joining us to talk about that are two members of the BCG Consulting Group, Seema Bansal and Shoikat Roy. And let me ask them each to introduce themselves before we get going to the substance of this conversation. Seema first.
Great. Hi, Don. Pleasure to be here. Like you said, my name is Seema Bansal. I've been with BCG now about 20 years, and I lead our work in what we call the social impact and the development sector. So we work very closely with governments, with development organizations, foundations on issues of public policy. A large part of our work is related to, populations at the bottom of the pyramid, and populations which are perhaps disenfranchised. So I think that's my sort of locus standi in this space.
Terrific. And Shoikat, thanks to you for joining us as well.
Pleasure to be here, Don. I work with Seema pretty closely over the last few years. I've been working primarily in the public policy space in school education, working with provincial and federal governments to try and improve the quality of public school education, especially to those at the bottom of the pyramid. Also have some experience in foreign affairs and sort of international relations. Um, you know, Probably want to caveat also that I do come from a place of privilege and have not personally experienced inequality the way many people, be it minorities or race, color, creed, religion, etc., do, but have been a part of several protests in India, which are also related to similar issues of inequality in India, which Black Lives Matter has also had surfaced here.
Yeah, and thanks so much to both of you for joining us and also for connecting to the Black Lives Matter movement, because one issue that may be of surprise to some Americans is just how far the Black Lives Matter movement has in fact reached, that in fact it's galvanized so much interest in India as well. And I was wondering if you could start first just by talking about the connection between what we've seen in the US, Black Lives Matter, and India in terms of the issues that you're facing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I think Black Lives Matter has been a topic of interest in India for many weeks now, pretty much from the beginning, I would imagine. It's been on the headlines in newspapers. It has found its way into, social media, Twitter, Facebook, and not just sort of in a certain part of the population, which is English speaking, but you would also find it, being discussed in the vernacular and across the entire country. So it has definitely reached India. And then what it has also done is, India definitely struggles and has struggled with varieties of inequality in its own way. We have inequality in terms of religion and religious minorities, the caste system, both within, the Hindu culture, the Hindu religion, but also pervading across some of the other religions, issues around minorities from different parts of the country, like the Northeast. Also, actually, just color, like the obsession with fair skin versus others. So there's many different types of inequalities that India has dealt with, and I think some of those have come back to the fore in the Indian context as this movement took root in the U.S.
What do you think the impact of the Black Lives Movement has been in India? What kind of issues have resonated most, and how do you think it's helped to stir this policy pot in a way that's helped to try to advance some of these debates?
Yeah, yeah. So sorry, I was just going to ask Shoikat actually, because I think, I think it's important to recognize that India went through something very similar earlier this year, late last year. So, there was a huge movement in India itself. And Shoikat, do you want to just talk about that first?
Right. So, as I was saying previously, Don, I think the underlying issues of inequality that one is seeing with race in the US, one sees the same thing in India with respect to different lenses and axes. One is color, one is religion, where, over the last 5-6 years, especially, there has been sort of heightened inequality and discrimination felt by certain religious minorities. The third is, of course, the caste lens, where you have historic and systemic discrimination that lower caste populations have faced across, hundreds and thousands of years. In India by upper caste populations in certain parts of the country. And you also have certain regional minorities, especially people in the Northeast who tend to get discriminated against in some parts of the country. So in that context, we have seen quite a few different protests break out, similar to Black Lives Matter, protesting discrimination. The biggest protest was the anti-CAA movement, which is a protest against a law, which is the Citizenship Amendment Act, which actually tried to discriminate between different religions on the fundamental question of citizenship. I won't get into the details of the legal details of how that discrimination happened, but it led to massive protests across every nook and corner of the country, lasted for weeks and months at a time, with thousands and thousands of citizens coming onto the streets to protest, legal discrimination almost on the basis of religion. That protest was intensifying to a huge degree before coronavirus struck, and was actually brought to a halt, partly by the lockdown and partly by the social distancing that had to be enforced because of the pandemic. So there are these underlying issues. Even when it comes to issues of caste, we have had a history of different protest movements on the basis of discrimination on caste lines. These protests have happened over the years and have gained steam at different points in time because of specific incidents of violence or specific incidents of discrimination. I do want to, however, look at general discrimination and the issue of police brutality differently, because while systemic discrimination exists along various different axes, part of the Black Lives Matter movement is also intrinsically tied with the question of police brutality against minorities. To that extent, India also has a history of police brutality. However, it plays out in very different ways in India. In India, while we do see a fair amount of police brutality when it comes to, let's say, even during the coronavirus pandemic, there were certain instances of the police beating up people from, low-income households and populations who were trying to go about basic needs. We have had cases of sort of extrajudicial killings that in some states have become frighteningly common, and even some of the courts have stepped in to sort of criticize the extrajudicial killings that have happened, often against members of minorities. And we have fairly deep sort of feelings of discrimination even amongst the police forces. Studies have pointed out, for example, that the police tends to view certain minorities as being more prone to crime. So we have that attitude of discrimination within the policing system in India as well, and several instances of brutality, as I said. However, in India, we do not see the same backlash against police brutality. To some extent, police brutality is almost more accepted in India than it is in the US. While we see huge protests against discrimination in general, violence against minorities, the issue of protest against police brutality typically hasn't come up. In fact, when police is violent, there is often sometimes tacit support from the population, such as that we have seen in the case of extrajudicial killings of various criminals or of various minorities that have actually happened. So there is a police brutality lens, but it is actually quite different in India in terms of the opposition to it. Whereas the opposition on grounds of discrimination in general in public and violence against the various minorities, we have had very similar protests over the last many years and decades.
So one interesting question is the degree to which the Black Lives movement, the Black Lives Matters movement, has really helped to galvanize a broader global kind of conversation around these issues. And to what degree do you think that that's actually helped to surface some of these issues?
Absolutely, I think. Sorry, Seema, go ahead.
So, what I'd say is that, as we were saying, that I think there was a huge, round of protests in India earlier this year. But because of Corona, I think everything kind of took a back seat over the last few months. And as the Black Lives Matters protest started in the US, you saw a number of people starting to comment on, the issue of Black rights, Black equality in the US, right? And starting to comment on, US society in general. But then you also saw an equally large group of people sort of saying, hey, we need to look inwards, right? We can obviously comment on the US and we can comment on what's going on there. But there's such a huge problem that we actually have within India, which we're not actually starting to speak of. So what the Black Lives Matter did is, while it started with everyone taking interest in it from a point of view of this is what's happening in the US and we need to have a point of view on that society and that country, but then very quickly it coming back to starting to look inwards and starting to question, the issues that India has been grappling with over many years. So we've been seeing a bit of that. Obviously, Corona still continues to take precedence over everything else, but I think it has brought back some of the attention to issues of inequality in India. Shoikat, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, if I could, like, there was specific incident, for example, there was, which went fairly public. There were a few West Indian cricketers, for example, and, cricket's a religion in India of its own. And there were a few West Indian cricketers who raised allegations of discrimination on grounds of race against cricketers in India, and how derogatory terms had been used against them. And that actually helped start a conversation as well. And that was basically because of the Black Lives Matter movement, about how certain derogatory terms are used towards Black people in India. And similarly, we also had, as Seema was saying, a sort of counter argument which started primarily because initially there was a lot of support for Black Lives Matter in India. And we had, for example, quite a few prominent personalities commenting on the Black Lives Matter in India, which led to its own sort of counter protest, which said that, as Seema was saying, that we need to look inward and sort of raising the issues of discrimination on lines of caste and religion that India itself faces to a huge extent, and saying that before we can, while we are expressing solidarity towards movements in the US, perhaps we should express solidarity towards similar movements in India, and sort of look inwards and focus upon the discrimination or similar discrimination that happens in the country as well. So to that extent, the Black Lives Matter movement has sort of sparked some of the conversations that had died down because of the coronavirus pandemic on issues of inequality. We've also had, one interesting example where, the sort of corporate and public sphere sort of tends to merge, is a lot of, actors and actresses were called out for their, for the perceived hypocrisy in their support to Black Lives Matter, given that many of them endorse fairness creams in India. There's a huge market for fairness and whitening creams in India because of the perceived sort of value of fair skin and white skin. And many sort of famous Bollywood personalities, for example, endorse these products. And there's been some amount of backlash towards that, also saying that, you can't pretend to support Black Lives Matter on one hand and on the other hand endorse all of these products, which is basically a, deepening a form of racial discrimination. And to some corporate companies, some big major manufacturers have actually started pulling products, not just in India, but also more broadly in Southeast Asia, which relate to whitening creams. So to that extent, we're already seeing that sort of an impact also happening as a consequence of the Black Lives movement.
As this is a set of issues, both here in the United States, among students who are interested in trying to have an impact, but also students in the United States with broader global interest in these wide ranges of issues that affect so many citizens in so many places. One of the questions for students in this field is trying to figure out how best to prepare themselves to try to have an impact on the questions. It's one thing to have growing concern about what these issues mean, another thing to try to figure out how to prepare themselves for actually how to make a difference. And I was wondering, from your experience, what kind of advice you'd have to students about what it is that they could best do to make sure that they're prepared to be able to make a difference as these issues roll on and as they do their very best to try to find ways of changing them.
Yeah. So let me start, and then Shoikat, I'll hand it over to you. I think it's two parts. To me, one is, focusing on understanding the topics deeply. I think oftentimes, especially when topics, occupy front pages of media and social media, a lot of the information and knowledge that students have is very superficial, borrowed knowledge. And I think being able to spend an adequate amount of time really deeply understanding the issue. And I would almost sort of say, from my point of view, playing on both sides of the story, right? I mean, if you believe in one thing, but if you really want to understand the issue, then you also have to put yourself on the other side, on the other side of the fence, and understand the issue and the perspective from that side. And I don't think students necessarily spend enough time being open to knowledge and being open to ideas and being open to developing their own thinking and the depth and the roots of, what the causes and the challenges are. And I think the second part of it is then being able to decide what is your, your own personal action agenda in this, so is your action agenda largely limited to, conversations inside classrooms or over dinner tables or on social media? Are you going to be politically active? Are you going to vote for someone? Are you going to go out there and be part of the protests? Are you going to, you know, work with an organization which is working on these topics? Are you going to work with communities? But I think it's very important to say, like, whatever it is, big or small, what is going to be your change agenda and your own sort of contribution to this change. And I think it's one thing to sort of say, I'm deeply interested in this topic and I can talk about it and I can take a view, but to take an informed view and to actually be action oriented, both of those to me are important, and enough focus needs to be there.
That sounds good. Shoikat, what's your sense of this?
Right. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure I'm the best person to even answer this question, because to some extent, I feel like I'm figuring out some of these answers for myself as well. I mean, there are issues, these are issues that we all care about, and trying to figure out the best way to approach this issue, the best way to be a part of the solution is something that I think, we're still figuring out. But I do think that two things that are important is that the first is I think to especially for those of us who come from positions of privilege, to understand that we are part of systems because of which discrimination happens, and to some extent we even benefit from those systems. And I think it's realizing that one is actually benefiting in a place of privilege, and being able to step away from that, to give space to people from minority populations, to populations that are being discriminated against, to let their voice be heard, over yours. Firstly, I think. Secondly, I would say that, I think it's really important to be a part of these movements, and not to sit on the sidelines, not just to be Twitter warriors, but to actively engage ourselves in whatever small way. That could be in the organization of a peaceful protest. That could be in, getting together local communities, and ensuring regular conversations are at least happening, within housing communities, within residential communities, that people are talking to each other instead of being more and more polarized, as what we're seeing happen on a, at a global scale. It could even mean, being politically active and participating in the political process in a multitude of different ways, not just electorally, of course. So I think the second most important thing is to move out of the comfort of being armchair activists, and participating in the political process deeply. And I think the third thing is just sort of realizing that, to just build on what Seema is saying, and to some extent what President Obama has also been saying of late, which is that to be wary of what some people call cancel culture, which is to wear one's own sense of morality on their sleeve, to the extent that it stops you from listening to what the other side has to say, even if you disagree with it. And I think that's really important. I think sometimes when we take strident positions in things that we believe in, such as equality of human beings at a very basic level, we sometimes do tend to stop listening to the other side at all and alienate the other side. And I think it's important to try, as difficult as it is, and I myself am guilty of that sometimes, to continue to listen to the other side while trying to explain your position to them.
Well, thanks so much. Seema Bansal, Shoikat Roy, both from BCG Consulting, speaking to us from India. Just cannot thank you enough for sharing these thoughts and observations, especially these lessons. I know that our students will enormously benefit from this, and we're grateful to you. So thanks so much for this conversation, and thanks so much for joining in it.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure.